So welcome back, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. I think we have a critical mass here. So this is session 2 of the Adaptation Planning and Practices course. So just a reminder, we are recording, so keep your sound on mute unless you want to talk, and questions are always welcome. So just unmute or even type your questions into the chat box and we'll monitor that as we go along. And then looks like everybody already renamed yourselves. So that's great, helps us identify you. And for today's lecture, your instructors are myself, Patricia Leopold, and also Erin Wilson. And Kristen is also here because we're all excited to hear a little bit more about your projects. So today we're going to spend our discussion time first, and we'll introduce ourselves and our projects. And then second will come the lecture portion for today, and that will cover step number 2. Erin will take over. He'll go over some key concepts and resources for thinking about climate change impacts. And then, as always, we'll wrap up our session today by outlining this week's assignment and our homework. So let's get to it. So first, we want to take no more than just a couple of minutes each to introduce our project. So it looks like we have 5 or 6 different teams on today. So that's going to be, 10 to 12 minutes total, and we want to leave enough time for lecture. So just try to stick under 2 minutes, and we want to hear your name and your organization. So, tell us who you're here representing if it's not yourself, your project name and location. And then we want to hear briefly, what are your big goals and maybe a couple specific objectives for your project? So what are you trying to do? So in a minute, I'm going to put up a map of Ohio, and you can each mark your project location. But first, we have to get used to the annotate functions. So somewhere near your picture on your little menu bar, you will see a pull down tab for view options and then annotate. So sometimes that little menu bar moves to the top of your screen or the bottom of your screen. It could be on the side depending on what your setup is. So it should have like your mute button and your chat box button and all that stuff. And so there's a button in there that says annotate, and you'll see a long horizontal menu appear, and then we want you to find the stamp button. So if you click on that stamp button, you're going to open up hearts and stars and other shapes that you can click on, and then you can just click anywhere on your screen and everyone will see it. So go ahead and get crazy with it right now. This is just practice. Go ahead and start annotating my screen. Yep. Oh, Jessica's going crazy. All right. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of markings. Good job. Give you just a minute to find it if you haven't already. There's also, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but there's a draw function as well, where you can click on that, and that allows you to kind of freeform it. But I don't think we need to go there today. So is anyone having trouble with this? Did we get everybody on the screen?
How would we know we're having trouble? I don't see, when I click on hearts and all that, it's only you seeing it, right?
No, everybody should see it.
I don't see it. I clicked on stamp, I clicked on heart, and then star, and then question, and I don't see anything.
Did you move your cursor onto my slide and click there?
Well, no.
So yeah, you got to pick one, and then you got to click
Oh,
on.
you gotta pick one.
Yeah.
I still don't see it.
So I just picked the heart stamp, right? And then I come over and I click and a heart should appear.
Nope.
On the screen. Huh.
Okay, I clicked you. Then, so I clicked you. Then I went to the stamp and I clicked stamp heart. And then I clicked you and all it did is flash. I'm okay. I'm okay not to make a comment.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so that's okay. We'll figure this out. But in the meantime, when we move to the next screen, if you can't get it to work there, I'll just call on you and you can tell us kind of in relation to Columbus or something where you are. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and clear all the drawings. So stop drawing on it. And then I will bring up the map of Ohio. Okay, so here we are. So go ahead and choose, it doesn't matter, star or heart or whatever you want to do, but just click your location on this map.
I made it work, yay!
Hooray!
It worked. Woohoo! When it mattered, it worked.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So you win the internet for today.
That'll be the last time, but I'm okay with that.
Okay, I've got a couple of people putting their project locations. So, okay. We have 4 projects up there. Anyone else still working on it? Okay, and then if you have your teammates here today, just pick one person to go ahead and introduce yourself and your teammates. So who would like to start?
Well, I can start. Annie Warmke, since I have my mute off. I'm Annie Warmke from Warmke Farm, which is a project of Blue Rock Station. And we have been in business about 17 years now as mainly an agritourism site, but I have done a lot of things with planting trees and food for wildlife because I want to feed everybody. But one of the things that I have wanted to do is to create a food forest because I feel that that is something that's going to deal with climate change and also a process that will deal with climate change and also will enable me to create a legacy that says that this place can earn a living or through forest products, non-timber forest products. We have earned a living, but not in that way specifically. And so I have 3 pieces to my project. One is that I'm about to construct a high tunnel and I'm going to put a mini food forest in there to protect fruit trees from wildlife and also the hard freezes that we've been getting the last couple of springs. And then I have a 1/2 acre pasture that I'm going to convert because I have the neighbors from hell with dogs that attack the fence when I am a goat herder. And so when my goats won't even go into that field. So we're going to create a food forest there. And then we have 35 acres that we're going to be working on to manage some areas that would attract wildlife. So they would come away from our projects. And I'm working with a forester that is going to expand our forest management plan that we've had for a while and not really done much with. And so I'm really excited to be a part of this and help myself get like really serious, not me personally, but with the people I'm dealing with. And we have just been asked and been accepted to be a part of a global network of food forests. And they're going to buy our first 100 trees for us, and they're going to sell those to individuals as sponsorships in Europe. And then we get to share part of the revenue, and they'll help us market our products. So that's really exciting. So we're on a roll.
That's awesome. And which mark are you? Where are you located?
I'm the heart that's down here by on the south of Zanesville, Philo, Ohio, on the Muskingum River.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Well, that's exciting, and we really look forward to hearing more about how you plan out adaptation on this project.
Now, me too.
We'll help you. We're here. We're right here with you. So who's next?
So we'll go next. I'm Susan Jennings, Executive Director of Agraria, which is outside of Yellow Springs. And our awesome AmeriCorps Vista, Sinuan Shi, is going to be talking to you about the project that she's been working on.
Hi everyone, so I'm Sinuan. I'm the AmeriCorps volunteer here at Agraria, and so we're partnering with Mark Amante from Central State University, and we're going to be working on a piece of our land. So it's 128-acre total farmland, but we're taking 30 acres of it, and we're trying to turn it into a silvopasture. We've been approved with an EQIP grant to put in fencing for a rotational grazing pasture, and we just want to take it to the next level and turn it into silvopasture. So we're looking at 4 different kind of demonstration sites, and it's definitely going to be a work in progress and like for the future, but I'm excited to see what happens with it.
Fantastic. Thank you. What a great project. Okay, who's next?
I'll go next. My name is Chris Rashan. I'm with Preservation Parks of Delaware County. We're a county park district. Project name, I think it's Sharmar Park Expansion, and I'm the little X just north of Columbus. So basically our project is about a 20-acre new acquisition for the park district. We manage about 1,500 acres total. This is just a 20-acre parcel that we purchased about a year ago. It's mostly a former row crop field with some hydric and semi-hydric soils, so wetland potential. We've got a little tributary stream that flows through it with real narrow wooded corridor. We want to reforest the field with native woody species and reduce invasive species in the tributary and keep them out of the field area. So basically our objective so far, plant native seedlings and complete invasive species management in the tributary and in the field.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. So we've got a good mix of forestry and farm projects so far. Very exciting. Okay. And next.
We can go next. I'm Jessica D'Ambrosio. I'm with the Nature Conservancy in Ohio, and my partner is Vicki Ray Thorne. She's on the call today, but having some screen issues. She can hear everybody though. And her family has an 80-acre farm up near the Toledo area in Northwest Ohio. It's the little yellow star I put up there. And she is interested in maximizing carbon sequestration, establishing a nature preserve to enhance the habitat in the Lake Erie watershed, having areas where there can be a cash crop to collect seeds and plugs for native species and restoration projects, and also reviving the local community through partnerships and local organizations. She is carrying on the legacy of her family, who had the land in Conservation Reserve Program for the last 27 years, and transitioning the farm as she takes it over into a place where she can have natives, have a variety of land management opportunities, and a variety of educational and healing opportunities. So she would like to, Vicki, chime in, and I see you're on the screen now, so chime in any time here. So she wants to create a 60 acres of the farm. The bulk of the farm will be a native plant nursery. She wants to revive and restore a 7-acre hardwood tree nursery or agroforestry area. In the short term, she may need to do a cash crop and have a hay rotation on 40 of the acres just to get the land back to get on top of the weeds. We're still working through that a little bit. She wants an oak corridor along the creek. She has about 5 acres of streamside area she wants to restore. She wants to have lots of birding trails. She wants to, of the areas where she does have housing and infrastructure, she wants to put renewable energy like solar and wind in for the future. She wants to eventually have a place where people can come and learn and be educated and have and almost like a maker space and a healing space. So she wants to have a shop, barns, a granary, chicken coop area. So the infrastructure of the land. She wants a special pollinator zone where people can come and learn about pollinator species. And very important is 3 acres of a medicinal plant and horticulture therapy area where members of the community can come and heal and learn how to heal others. And she also already has on the property 5 acres of wetlands. So we want to restore that and put a nice native buffer area around it.
Wow, so nothing big, huh?
No. We struggled to come up with ideas.
Well, that sounds fantastic. And I'll just plant this seed, pun intended. So if you're thinking about a native plant and tree nursery, we've got the tools to kind of look ahead. When a lot of folks are thinking about adaptation, they're choosing these future adapted tree species that they want to plant on their properties, but then often not finding those species in the local nurseries. And so if there's any room at all to think about that and the potential role that you could play in providing your peers with some of those special future adapted tree species, we'll come to that later in the course. So just a plug. That's very exciting. Okay, who's next?
I can be. This is Petra Schmalbrook, and I'm with volunteer with Flow, so I'm not a professional like many of you. Laura Fay, who is also on the call, is the scientific director of Flow, which is an organization in Columbus, Friends of the Lower Olentangy Watershed. And the specific project that we picked is an area. There's a blue arrow in the northwest corner of Columbus, Sawmill Wetlands. It's a 17-acre wetland remnant that is totally surrounded by heavy-duty development, shopping malls, large urban housing, the whole bit. There's roads all the way around. So it's about a 7-acre also poor forested area, some very old for trees in there, I'm guessing 100 years or so. And of course, given the location, the whole perimeter is nothing but honeysuckle. So the questions that we hope to address with this is best management practices for getting rid of the honeysuckle and what to replace it with, and how to control it, given that is all edge habitat by covered or surrounded by roads, and how to best maintain the area inside the pool, which is a lot of ash, a lot of dead ash, of course, but a lot of ash seedlings. If that should be reforested, and learn more about how to go about that.
Great, thank you, Petra. And I was just this week working on a couple of ash examples that other folks are in different places, New York and in Michigan, for example. They're asking the same kind of questions about what do you do with that EAB affected ash. And so I'll pull together those examples and email them to you so you can take a look at those. They'll be totally different from what you're trying to do, but you might find some inspiration in those. Great. Is that everybody? I think that might be everybody. Just don't want to move on and miss anyone. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. That was a great tour through your projects. You're all doing such amazing things. And so it's really exciting to know that this is our group. So we have 5 really solid, amazing projects that we're going to take all the way through this adaptation course. And so hopefully we'll be able to keep sharing information with each other through each step of the way, and we'll be able to learn from each other. Another thing is that even though you're learning this process for the first time and figuring things out, and you don't know where things are going yet, by the end of the course, you will have this example where you have really thought all the way through from, what am I trying to do with my project? How does climate change affect that? And then what are those adaptation strategies that I can put into play to help me achieve my goals and objectives? And we can actually do a small write-up for you to become an adaptation demonstration on our website. So just a short description of your project, and then you can actually become an example for folks in Ohio who are trying to do similar or not so similar things, but they'll be able to at least look at your project and see that's what adaptation looks like. So keep that in mind, and we'll give you more information about that. No need to sweat about it right now. You can decide, even after the course is over, whether you want to do that or not. So hopefully everybody was able to get their project set up. Let me go ahead and clear these markings. Actually, I'm going to go. No, that's okay. I'm not a great multitasker. I can't talk and do things at the same time. So hopefully everybody had a chance to go into the adaptation workbook and upload your answers for step number 1. I had sent an email out after the newsletter that we were having a problem with just the course content. So once you get into the project, you can fill it out and everything will be okay. But then that course content that just shows you what resources you would be able to access for that step, that wasn't updating. But now we have it fixed. And so everything should appear just like it appears in the syllabus. It was just a minor glitch. So let me know if you're having any issues getting into the website, or this is really important. You have to, when you create your project, you have to link it to the adaptation course. And so a little box will pop up and you just need to click that you're adding it to the Ohio Farm and Forest adaptation course. And then that will give you access to all the course content and the homework. So if you already set up your project and you're not seeing that, let me know. You don't have to start over. I can go in on the back end and put your project into the course. So just shoot me an email or stay online after we're done here today and we can get you all sorted out. So we're just about ready to move on now to step number 2. So step number 1, hopefully that was relatively easy for you and you've landed on a good manageable project. Before we move on, does anyone have any burning questions about step number 1?
This is Laura Fay from Flow. And I was wondering, according to figure 2, what you would call the western part of Ohio as in terms of eco-regional project area.
Yeah, so eco-regional in terms of, and this might actually be better explained by Erin's slides that are coming up, but essentially the forest vulnerability assessment that I co-authored that's part of this course covers that eastern part of Ohio because the majority of forest cover is on that eastern side. That's why we went with those boundaries. So for the western part of Ohio that's not forest covered, we're using the Midwest climate assessment. And so it's not covered by what we would call an eco-regional project of the climate change response framework, but it still has a set of resources that is associated with it. So when you move to step number 2, no matter where you dropped your pin, you're going to have information come up for you. Does that help?
Yes, it does.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. Yes, and Erin will give us a little more information on that in just a minute. Anything else?
I just have a general, so we had done a worksheet in a Word document and filled out our goals and our tactics and our objectives. And then I went back in to put them into the workbook. It became, we didn't quite line up our an objective for each goal. So we kind of had overall, we had objectives that we thought we wanted to complete in a timeline. But then the workbook wants us to have each goal and each tactic has to have a set of objectives with it. How critical is that? And then should we go back and make sure that, because I feel like I'm just copying and pasting the same things multiple times.
Let's talk after this. So I can help you try to organize that, and there's a couple of tricks to just, especially if you have a lot of objectives like your project has, we can figure out if, maybe it's just creating an additional broad goal that you can fit a number of those objectives under. So think about that and we can talk offline.
Okay.
Yeah, good question though. So if others are having the same problem, let me know. Okay. So Erin, I stopped sharing my screen and you can go ahead and bring up your slides.
We should be on this slide, correct?
Yep, we are seeing your notes though. There we go.
Yep.
Fantastic. Take it away.
All right. Yeah, so where are we at? Okay, now I got it. All right, so yes, hopefully, we're starting to get situated as Patricia said in the workbook, and get those goals and objectives kind of narrowed down a little bit. It was really nice hearing the diversity of the projects that are taking place in a mix of ag and forestry for sure. So this week we're again going to focus on step 2, really diving down and thinking about assessing particular climate change impacts and vulnerabilities, and about the specific impacts of climate change in your area. So, we're thinking about climate change here in Ohio, what it means to Ohioans, and certainly more specifically what it means to your project area and the areas that you're located. So a lot of this lecture is going to be sharing, some of those great resources, really about sharing those resources that are out there. So really, step 2, again, assessing the site-specific climate change impacts and vulnerabilities. In this step, we're really answering 2 main questions. What climate change impacts are most important to your project area? And this usually involves identifying some broader regional trends, right? So regional trends across the Midwest, across the Great Lakes, and then really specifying how those trends are likely to affect your particular site. We all, for instance, might look at things like increases in extreme precipitation, for example. That's going to be more or less important depending on, are you in a riparian site? Are you on a hilltop, upland forest? Are you sitting in a valley? Are you flood prone? All of those questions come into play with your particular area. And that leads us to the second question, which is how vulnerable is your project area to these cumulative effects? We know how these variables act in isolate. We can narrow down how temperature, how precipitation changes, but really what are the cumulative effects of these changes that are happening locally? And that will help us determine then the vulnerability in this step. So step 2 really comes in 2 main parts. We'll discuss both parts in a little bit more detail, but just to kind of reiterate, the big idea here is to take these regional resources like the Central Apps Forest Ecosystem Vulnerability Assessment or the Midwest chapter of the National Climate Assessment, and then identify which impacts matter most to where you live and work, right? So we're scaling down what those impacts are and what they mean to your particular project area. So regional climate impacts scaled down to site-specific impacts. So for the first part, it's really about identifying those broad regional trends. We have information, and Patricia and the group has really curated a lot of that for you. Part of the challenge to responding to climate's really not a lack of information. You know, the scientific evidence is overwhelming of the changes that are taking place, but it's sometimes overwhelming in terms of that information, right? There's just so much to decipher and to go through. So, you know, there's certain resources that have been developed that specifically address land managers, for instance. We'll focus on some of those in this course. But if there are other resources that you find available or relevant to you, you can absolutely use those as well. So we're not really at a loss for resources. We're thinking about how do we apply the resources that we have specific to our region. So the resources that really have been put together here are designed for, again, for land managers, by land managers, with scientists, resource specialists, so that they can focus on topics that you're most likely to want to focus on here. So it's really a short list of resources that will help you start to narrow in on the climate change information that, again, is relative to your project. I know sort of repeating this idea, but we're scaling the information down so that it's usable and useful to your particular area. So really the easiest resource here, this is the Adaptation Workbook Impact Statement, right? So this is actually contained within step 2 of the Adaptation Workbook. When you drop your pin on the map inside the workbook, that's going to automatically pre-populate your step 2 regional impacts, right? So it's going to impact, so whether you choose a forest or you choose an agricultural project, it's going to determine what you see in that list, right? So you'll see on this map that Western Ohio, for instance, is drawing mainly from the Midwest chapter of the National Climate Assessment. So Laura had the question about those regions. You can see as it's outlined here, the western half of the state is really in that Midwest climate chapter, while the eastern portion of the state, where we have a lot of our forests, Mohican, Zielinski, Wayne, and the like, is really covered by the Forest Ecosystem Vulnerability Assessment. Okay, I would say that later on the resources for you know, the climate resources certainly are something that are useful, right? So we've got these broad climate trends that work across the region. It's just how they impact, right, the vulnerability depending on an ag project or a forest project is what we're thinking about here. So really your first task is to open up this list and review those impacts and whether they seem relevant to your particular project. You know, if it's something that really doesn't apply to you, you can just click the X and delete it. So there, an example there, you can just click the X and delete it. If it doesn't apply to you, you know, you can click on the comment button to provide more information. For example, if the impact reads low diversity systems are at a greater risk, okay, then you might provide the information that your red pine plantation contains few other species, for instance. And lastly, we sort of encourage you to dig into the evidence for these statements by clicking on the icon, the info icon here, okay? So that's what we're going to see. Click on the info icon here, read the evidence that really supports these statements that we're seeing on your step 2, okay? All right, so a little bit more about these vulnerability assessments and climate change response frameworks here. You know, Ohio is in the Appalachians Climate Change Response Framework, covers the forested regions of these major geographies, so they're going to have slightly different resources than non-forested areas or our agricultural projects. And I'll share a couple of resources here in just a moment. The Central Apps Framework is an ongoing network of partners working together to develop and share tools for adaptation planning. That's really what we're here for. The Vulnerability Assessment contains specific information on impacts to major forest ecosystems. such as things like a beech maple or an oak hickory type forest. If you have a forest project, your syllabus asks you to review specifically materials from the vulnerability assessment, including a video that summarizes climate change impacts that are specific to the forested regions, and handouts that show which tree species are projected to lose or gain suitable habitat based on these future climate change scenarios. Okay, so again, that's going to cover the eastern half of our state in terms of these specific forest ecosystem framework. So again, vulnerability assessments, impacts lists, and videos, and tree species lists that are really going to help thinking about the future of forests in this region. Okay. So if you selected, for example, a beech maple forest in step 1, okay, as a management unit, you're also going to see a list of vulnerabilities appear for that forest type, and you'll treat these the same way that you treated the regional impacts. But these are statements that an expert panel agreed were important for a particular forest type. Okay, so you can see here that the information focuses on species found within this forest type, or insect pests known to be problematic here in this type of beech maple forest. So again, it's up to you. You're going to decide which are relevant to you, which of these vulnerabilities are relevant to you, and either delete them or provide more information specifically about your site and how your site ties in to the vulnerabilities that you see here, right? So different species, pests, and things that you see on this, on these statements. And of course, if you want more, I mean, the main source of information is the vulnerability assessment. In this vulnerability assessment is the Climate Tree Atlas, which I know several of you have already asked about. That presents really modeled changes in the suitable habitat for 134 tree species in the eastern US based on inventory data, forest inventory data, and downscaled climate models. I'll take a moment to think about downscaled climate models. Again, the climate models themselves are run at larger, what we call resolution. So, they may be looking at half of the state, for instance, but that data has then been downscaled to, based on local topography and things like that, that help us get a little bit more information at the local scale. So these resources have all been developed by NIAX and NRS, Louis Iverson, Matt Peters, Anantha Prasad, and Steve Matthews, and presented in this video here. Okay, the video is about 60 minutes long, but it's worth your time if you want to learn how to use that tree atlas. I know that we've with the Bird Polar and Climate Research Center at OSU, we've talked about the tree atlas as well and really pushed it out as a great, fantastic resource for soil and water conservation district talks and otherwise. And it's really, thinking about how to use, the tree atlas, or how to use the heat and hardiness zones to address climate change impacts on certain plant species, for instance, that weren't modeled necessarily by the tree atlas. So this link is also in your syllabus. So again, these are the forest ecosystem forest project resources, again, using the heat and hardiness zones to really address climate change impacts in other plants as well. Okay. All right, so we feeling good with the forestry information. Kind of switching now to the agricultural resources. So if specific agricultural resources, if you have an ag project, the course syllabus also has links to Ohio climate change resources that we put together at OSU and others. And the regional impacts that are displayed in your step 2, again, are drawn from the Midwest chapter of the National Climate Assessment, the latest National Climate Assessment. Again, these resources are listed in your syllabus. I have also additionally provided a 30-minute video discussing the local climate change and impacts to agricultural systems here in Ohio. So what are the trends in precip, temperature, growing season, and then a lot of the impacts that we think about from pests and weeds and water and flooding and all of those really discussed in this video link here that you see under the green box. and the slides that go to that video also at this link here as well. So a couple of additional resources that I tried to put together, really largely based on information that I try to present in a lot of different arenas across the state, talking about these impacts. What are the local changes that are taking place and facing agricultural lands here in Ohio? Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how to assess site level impacts and vulnerabilities. Some of you may already be familiar with the climate science and the impacts on ecosystems. Some of us have studied that for many years, while others, this may be, kind of a whole new consideration that you're just getting into and just diving into. So we want to just take the time to get familiar with the impact statements and other resources that are part of this course. So then once that you have that, once you have that background, we can think about how exactly this regional information applies to your particular place, right? Each state is going to have vary somewhat even across the state. These ecological zones obviously have transition boundaries, so there's areas that somewhat overlap when we think about our different areas. So each site varying a little bit, even within Ohio, depending on soils, hydrology, land cover, what's the vegetation and the wildlife types, and a lot of others, right? We know for those of us that have traveled from northwest to southeast or west to east, the state has a lot of diversity in terms of these sites. So really we want to know our site even better, right? You already know it better than anyone else. So the ball is really in your court to decide your site level trends, right? Building down from those regional trends and using the information and knowledge that you have about your particular sites to help assess these impacts and vulnerabilities at this level. So remember, in this step, we're answering two main questions, right? What climate change impacts and vulnerabilities are most important for your project area? And how vulnerable is it overall? So it brings up a good question about the vulnerability, right? Again, so we've covered where and how to determine your regional impacts, and now we're stepping down to the site level. This is where your knowledge and your expertise, and probably most importantly, your familiarity with the site come into play. This is the land that you're tending to and the forest that you're tending to on a frequent basis. So the important part is to conceptualize how climate may affect that area that you care about, those site-specific impacts based on your expertise, right? We don't share your eyes, and you can see your site and you live your site, so you know how best to apply these regional climate impacts at your site. So for example, okay, from a vulnerability assessment, the regional climate change impact is a projected increase in extreme rain events, our 2-inch, 3-inch, 4-inch rain events per hour, or even our multi-day events as well at the local level, right? We know that these types of events don't typically occur everywhere at once, but they do impact more sites with time. And so, at that local level, the site manager's already been noticing, right, an increase in erosion and flood frequency because the site is located near a headwater stream, right, in this example. Intense precipitation are becoming more frequent. It's located at the headwater stream and will experience greater erosion, okay? Now, another forest manager, for instance, is also expecting an increase in extreme rain events. But because they're located near a housing development with lots of impermeable surfaces, that land manager is more concerned about that stormwater runoff and standing water around their urban trees, right? So you can see how the climate impact of extreme rainfall would impact different, sites a little bit differently based on their vulnerability, okay? So another example is back to something I mentioned earlier about the lengthening growing season. One manager might be thinking about natural regeneration, right, of forest, plants, and trees. A couple of you mentioned that when you were describing your projects here, and vulnerable to a longer growing season, right? Another manager may be thinking about a farm system that gets planted and see potential positive impacts from climate change. If we just think about a single variable like temperature increasing the length of the season, right? Again, so you can see some positives maybe that are specific to your particular site. But this is an example, and really these are examples to start showing you really how you are the most knowledgeable person at your site, right? You can specify exactly how these broad trends are likely to impact your particular situation. So I think through this course, we're really asking you to be specific and asking yourself, really, be specific as possible and tell us exactly what species that you're thinking about or what components of your site that you're most worried about, and then tell us why. Right? And then that just becomes a very personal experience and a very tangible experience throughout this adaptation process as well. So in the adaptation workbook, you know, that it'll look like this, okay? You'll see your broad regional impacts. There are 8 identified for this ag project, for instance, and then you'll see your management units directly under that. If you choose a forest project and your management units are forest types, then this will pre-populate for you, okay? But if you choose an ag project or a unique management type, then you'll see your topic listed with this red warning symbol, okay? You see the red warning symbol there. That indicates that you have no vulnerabilities listed, okay? You can click on the orange box to add a custom vulnerability, and you would do that if your management unit has an obvious impact or vulnerability that was not captured really by the regional trends, or if the trend manifests a little bit differently in your crop system than it does in a wetland system, for instance. So please, if you want a little bit more help filling this out, filling out the workbook here, click on that pull down arrow and read the instructions. Okay, which also contain a link to a tutorial video. So there are multiple ways of getting this information here, okay? And then we get to the second part of step 2, right? Which is to ask you to rate the overall vulnerability of each of your management topics. I'm going to describe this process in just a minute, but the reason this can be useful is because if you have multiple management units, okay, you can rate their vulnerability individually and then see how one unit might be more or less vulnerable than others. This is a way that also perhaps lets you prioritize actions that take place at your particular site as well. If you see a lot of different adaptation strategies, prioritizing actions is often a part of that as well. But looking at, you know, your most vulnerable, that might be something that you address and first. And this is a way of allowing you to do that. Okay. So of course we've been mentioning and throwing this around, vulnerability. What is vulnerability, right? What do we mean by vulnerability? Okay, right. So vulnerability is the degree to which a system is susceptible to and unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change, including climate variability and extremes. So oftentimes we get a lot of information about the means are changing, it's overall it's warm, but it's really that climate variability and extremes are very much a part of this, right? So how much climate change is going to disrupt your particular management site? So there are 2 components to vulnerability. One is the potential impacts, and the other is the adaptive capacity, right? You can be vulnerable. Obviously, you can identify vulnerabilities, but we have to ask the question, and we'll go into these in a moment, but these are the definitions that we've used here in this assessment, and a lot of other frameworks use similar of these definitions as well. So it can be pretty useful in thinking about vulnerability and what major factors are contributing to that vulnerability. Okay, so that's really what we're doing here throughout this course. So the potential impact of climate change can be thought as a combination of 2 things, right? It's what is the system exposed to, right? So that could be changes in extreme temperatures, hydrology, or different stressors. And the second part is how sensitive is the system to those changes, right? Understanding what is the capacity. And this combination of these 2 things will likely support the health and the function of that overall system. Or it's likely to disrupt the system if it's highly sensitive, right? Highly sensitive and it's got a lot of exposure. So it's trying to understand to what degree, right? The big question, are the potential impacts likely to support or disrupt the health and function of our system? And so two forests might be exposed to the same impact, a warming, say, of 3 degrees Fahrenheit. But a spruce forest is going to be
Looks like we lost Aaron. Everybody can hear me? Okay. We'll wait for Aaron to pop back in. Hopefully he'll figure out that we can't hear him anymore. But I can try to move us along here until we get him back. So he was just covering this example that 2 different forests could both be exposed to the same climate change impact. But in this example, an alpine forest is going to be more sensitive to those changes because it's adapted to those cooler, wetter conditions. And something like an oak hickory forest is going to be less sensitive because it's adapted to a warmer, hotter climate. So let me scroll down to where we've got our slides here. I don't see that Aaron is come back. Okay, and then I'll just share my screen. Perfect. Okay. So we were on vulnerability and what is the definition of vulnerability? So now we're moving on to adaptive capacity. So adaptive capacity refers to the resilience of an ecosystem to those climate change impacts, or in other words, what characteristics of this system would allow it to recover from an impact or a disturbance. So the big question here is, how resilient is the system to potential climate change impacts? And so one example of adaptive capacity is a forest that is composed of many tree species. It's more likely to persist than a forest that contains only 1 or 2 tree species, because not all tree species will be affected in the same way. And if one of them fails, then there are still others in that same community that could persist and keep the forest largely intact with the same identity that it had prior to the disturbance. And then another example would be a farm system for which the soils have been no-till for many years and are more likely to remain productive and have higher soil moisture capacity than soils that have been heavily tilled or overused in the past. So these are just examples. They're not always true all of the time, but you can know some of the exceptions to these examples. So please use that knowledge to really describe your own systems and what might set them up better or worse to deal with those climate change impacts. That's what adaptive capacity is all about. So here are some other examples of what might be considered impacts and adaptive capacity factors. So under impacts, anything related to temperature, precipitation, major ecosystem drivers, stressors, anything from pests, pathogens, drought, whatnot, and then even the key species that are located there, whether you have a spruce forest or an oak hickory forest, and how they're set up to deal with different climatic changes. And then under adaptive capacity, we have, the ability of the system to cope with that change. So the species tolerance or plasticity. So how, for example, its seedlings might fare during multiple years of drought, or whether it has high or low diversity. or whether it has multiple ways to respond to disturbance. For example, if a tree can reproduce by seedlings and it can reproduce by sprouting, that might give it a competitive edge. So hopefully you can start to see that your impacts might be greater in this system, and that, you know, the system has a low ability to cope with these impacts, or vice versa, your system might have low impacts and a high adaptive capacity. And remember, when we're assessing vulnerability, we're really thinking about just the climate change impacts at this point and their inherent ability to overcome those impacts, and not necessarily what we as managers can do to help them. That comes later in step number 4 when we're choosing our adaptation strategies. So we're not changing our management quite yet. We're just thinking about the vulnerability of the individual species. And then did I hear, Aaron, did you come back in?
Yeah, I came back in, my computer overheated.
Oh no. Do you want me to keep going, or would you like to take over?
We were pretty close to the transition, so you can go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So here is an example of how you're going to assess vulnerability. So for this example, let's take a quick field trip out east. This is from a higher elevation site in western Massachusetts on the Notch View Reservation. So this is a northern hardwood red spruce forest. It's about 3,000 acres with a number of high quality habitats. And it's a great place for recreation. So a lot of people go skiing there. So this site is also at the southern extent for red spruce, meaning that most of the suitable habitat for red spruce is farther north in New England and even up into Canada. So when the managers for this site looked at potential impacts, they were concerned about warming temperatures. Although at a higher elevation, they might not see as much warming as their neighbors at lower elevations. But being higher elevation, they're already seeing more extreme rain and wind events, and they're at greater risk of ice storms as well. And some of their species like spruce and fir are projected by models like the Climate Change Tree Atlas to decline in out east. So when they looked at their adaptive capacity, those species really couldn't tolerate much warming at all. And the site is already stressed by a number of invasive plants, deer herbivory, emerald ash borer. And so they were looking at a reduced adaptive capacity to deal with any climate related changes. And so they used this information to evaluate their overall vulnerability, and they rated this system as highly vulnerable to climate change. The spruce fir is expected to be largely lost by the end of the century, while some of the other northern hardwood species are likely to start declining and may even see regeneration failure first as early by the middle of the century. So how they got to that rating of high vulnerability was by using the system that you'll see in the Adaptation Workbook. So you'll do this as part of your own process. In step 2.2, you'll have sliders, and you'll do a vulnerability determination for each of your management topics, your ecosystems, or your land cover types, whatever you listed in step number 1 as your management unit. And so you'll first rate the potential impacts on this slider, and then you'll rate your adaptive capacity on the bottom slider. And then the tool will put the two items together for you. So for the Notch View example, we rated impacts as disruptive. So you can see that here. And then we rated adaptive capacity as low to moderate. So we just moved the slider over here. And then the system gave us a determination of high vulnerability. And so it shows you on this chart, you know, where it put the dot. And then up here, it shows you definitively what your vulnerability determination is. So you just do that relatively quickly for each of your management sites. Don't spend too much time on this. Again, it's really useful for being able to compare relative vulnerability between your different management units. And so you just quickly want to think about all of your climate change impacts and whether they're largely disruptive or largely supportive, or if they're mixed or neutral. They don't really affect things one way or the other. And then in terms of adaptive capacity, you know, again, think about the system. And if it's a system that tolerates disturbance really well, then it might have higher adaptive capacity. But if this is a really sensitive system with a very narrow set of ecological tolerances, then you might rate that system as lower. So move through those pretty quickly, and you know, just set yourself up to be able to use those if you need to. And if this feels overwhelming and you're worried that you might have a hard time deciding to how to evaluate your system, just don't stress out about it. There is not a right or a wrong answer for any of this. And the important thing to do is to just try to complete the exercise and to think about your overall vulnerability in that relative way. This system is more vulnerable than this system, or this is an extremely vulnerable system. This is a low vulnerability system. And then outlining your ideas about what factors you think will increase or decrease vulnerability is really useful. The determination can also give you an initial sense of whether you need to be concerned about a particular management topic or area, or potentially help you think about which of your management topics might be at greatest risk. And you can always talk to your colleagues or others and decide to change your rating. And after you get a little bit more information, you can go back in and change your rating. So again, here's just some pro tips for when you're ready to head to step 2 and start to fill out that workbook. You'll see a list of those pre-populated statements about the impacts of climate change that are specific to your geographic location. And remember, this was already done for you when you dropped your pin on the map. So just remove the ones that don't work for you, and then get really specific about the ones that do work for you. And then, you know, feel free to add your own custom impact. If you see something in the Midwest Climate Assessment or the National Assessment or the video that Erin shared with you, you can add your own custom impact and then really get specific about why you're worried about that on your site. And then you use our adaptation workbook, cookbook tutorial, the PDF or the videos that are embedded in each of the steps. And if you still can't figure something out, reach out. We will be happy to work through this with you. So assignments for next time, we will be reaching out to you to set up a time for you to check in with us and just make sure that you're feeling good about the information and the way you're entering it into the workbook. So follow up with us. We can do that over email, or we can do it over the phone. And let us know if you need regionally appropriate resources. So if you're just not seeing the stuff that you need, we can help you find that. So your assignment is to complete step number 2, watch the videos, review your resources, and then complete the homework section by next Monday. So looking ahead then, our next lecture is on Tuesday, March 9th, and the lecture will introduce step 3, which is all about After then you have identified your impacts and vulnerabilities, how does that affect your ability to meet your management goals and objectives? And so we'll identify our challenges and opportunities. And again, we'll reach out to schedule a time to check in with you about that. And then the following week is actually a break week. So if you're starting to feel, you know, like this is a lot of work, we're going to give you a break week to catch up, check in with us, and catch up. So don't panic. There's plenty of time to get everything done. And with that, I apologize for being just a few minutes over today, but we will stick around if you have any questions or comments that you would like to share with us. So with that, thank you so much for spending your time with us today, and we will see you next week.
Thank you.
Hey, Patricia, this is Laura. I have a question, if I may. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Please go ahead.
I was wondering about the sort of reliability of the data for the western part of the state, since it seems like it's projected to be all agriculture or prairie, and we're talking about trees there. So is there more uncertainty?
No, there's not any additional level of uncertainty with the climate projections. You're still going to see the same broad regional climate trends and things. But I have a note written to follow up with you, and we can do this when we check in with your step number 1. But so folks who are using the eastern half of the data are going to have those tree species information just kind of pop up for them. But for you, what I can do is go in and look at the statewide data for Ohio and get you some information that will help guide your decisions over there. So I'll pull that information together. I may even be able to get a little more regional, like to the northwest part of Ohio. So I'll try to do that. But, you know, worst case scenario, we'll just go with the statewide data. Does that sound good?
Yes. Yes. Thank you very much. That'll help.
Patricia, I'd be interested in that too. I'm like 30 miles or less north of Laura. I'm not that far away.
Yeah, okay.
I would say from a climate perspective, one of the things that is important is that the elevation, for instance, in central Ohio is not that much different than it is in western and even in eastern. I mean, relatively speaking, right? So in other words, if we were in an area where we're talking, you know, a big elevation change, then there could be distinct climate, you know, impacts between those two regions. But generally the climate vulnerabilities, or at least the climate piece of this, is pretty consistent. There's some regional differences, but it's pretty consistent across the state. So that's just something else to keep in mind as well.
Right. And when you go to your workbook, you know, the forest vulnerability assessments have drawn their own broad regional trends from the climate data. And those are on like a 12-kilometer square grid. And for you folks that are outside the forest assessment area, that information is just being drawn from the Midwest Climate Assessment, and it's importing information on a relatively similar scale. It might be 12 or 20 square kilometers that the grid sizes are at. And so it's kind of the difference between, you know, looking sharply at a pixel and blurring your eyes when you look at a set of pixels. And so you're really getting a sense for the general direction of where the temperature is headed at different points in the future. But there's, you know, with any source of data, there's an amount of uncertainty about, you know, how fast are those changes really going to manifest, and are they going to be on the lower end of the climate changes or on the higher end of the climate changes? And what we do and encourage all of our participants to do is not focus on the lowest scenario or the highest climate change scenario, but really consider that full spectrum of scenarios and, thinking, our future climate could change from 2 degrees Fahrenheit, or it could change, all the way up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. And really work within that uncertainty as forest managers. So set yourself up to eventually choose the adaptation actions that are going to help you address those changes, whatever they may be, to the best of your ability.
I selected urban because of the location being surrounded by urban development. Reason being that probably Columbus, there is a heat island. Is that included in the way the workbook is set up?
Yeah, actually, so if you chose an urban project and you go to step number 2, you're going to see those more urban considerations appear for you. And one of it is going to be that urban heat island effect. And it's going to give you a range, I think, of, this number of degrees to this number of degrees hotter than surrounding natural areas. And if you know more specifics for your area, so on average, it's exactly 5 degrees hotter than other areas nearby, then that's the kind of information that you can include in your site-specific impacts or those little comment bubbles, because more information and better information for your site. So you can include that there.
And I'll make a note too. We have some products that are available to look at, for instance, the urban heat island across Columbus and how it's changed. We've worked with students on campus, for instance, and we know, well, actually, Columbus has one of the most rapidly growing urban heat islands in the country. At times, it's 24 degrees warmer in Broad Street than it is outside the Outer Belt. And on average, it's 4.4 degrees. And in the northwest portion, actually, is the cooler portion of Columbus, if you look at it, because everything to the east and southeast is downwind of the built environment. You're actually upwind of most of the built environment. And so that will actually keep the northwest quadrant. This is why you always see snow when I see freezing rain down here south of 71, is because it tends to be cooler on that side of the city. So I'll make a note and I can provide some additional, we have some heat maps and things like that we can look at the region to get a sense of what the typical urban heat island looks like here in that particular region for both those projects, Chris and Petra.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so we'll be in touch.